I planned everything for our 5th anniversary trip to Saint Lucia. 5 days later, my husband announced he was going on a cruise with his daughter and his ex-wife on that exact day. No explanation, no apology. Then he texted saying his daughter needed both her parents there. I smiled and replied. The moment he read my message, his face went pale. Wait, what? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who completely underestimated your worth. I am Vivian, 36 years old, and for the entirety of my marriage I played the role of the quiet, unassuming wife. My husband thought I was just a mid-level tax auditor who spent her days buried in mundane spreadsheets. He had no idea that I was actually the founder and chief executive officer of an elite forensic accounting firm, contracting directly with the federal government to hunt down white-collar criminals. And he certainly had no idea that my latest target was him. The late afternoon sun was casting long, warm shadows across the imported hardwood floors of our Washington District of Columbia townhouse. I stood in the center of our master bedroom, carefully folding a silk emerald green evening gown and placing it into my hardshell luggage. I had spent 4 meticulous months arranging this anniversary getaway. It was supposed to be a celebration of our 5 years of marriage, a milestone that I genuinely thought carried some weight. I smoothed out the delicate fabric with the palm of my hand, feeling a quiet sense of anticipation. I had already set up a highly encrypted out-of-office protocol for my firm, routing all urgent federal agency communications to my secure secondary devices. To the outside world, and specifically to my husband Xavier, I was simply taking some time off from my boring little desk job at a local accounting branch. I hummed softly to myself, double-checking the resort itinerary that I had printed and placed neatly on the polished oak vanity. We had reservations for private beach cabanas, exclusive sunset dinners, and couples spa retreats. I was looking forward to disconnecting from my intense investigative work and finally spending some quality time with the man I married. The heavy bedroom door swung open with a harsh thud, breaking the peaceful silence. Xavier walked in aggressively, loosening his expensive silk tie. He was 39 years old and served as the vice president of a prominent wealth management firm downtown. He wore his arrogance like a custom-tailored suit, carrying an air of absolute superiority wherever he went. He did not greet me. He did not ask how my day was or comment on the open suitcases laid out across our bed. Instead, he marched straight over to my vanity, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards. He picked up the beautiful gold foil boarding passes and the detailed resort itinerary I had left out for him. He stared at the documents for barely 3 seconds before his lips curled into a sneer. Without a single word of hesitation, he dropped the entire stack of premium tickets straight into the wicker trash can beside the dresser. I stopped folding my clothes. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show any immediate sign of panic. A seasoned investigator never reacts emotionally to a sudden shift in behavior. I simply stood up straight, crossed my arms, and asked him what exactly he thought he was doing. Xavier let out a loud, dramatic sigh, the specific kind of exaggerated exhalation you give to an annoying child who is asking far too many foolish questions. "Cancel Saint Lucia," he commanded, unbuttoning his cuffs with rapid, impatient movements. "I am going on a 14-day luxury cruise to the Bahamas with Vanessa and Brielle instead. Vanessa cannot handle Brielle in her volatile teenage phases alone anymore. They need me there to provide stability." I stood perfectly still, letting his ridiculous justification hang in the quiet air of the bedroom. Vanessa was his ex-wife, a woman who treated her high society memberships like profound personality traits and used their 15-year-old daughter as a constant heavy weapon to drain Xavier of his time, his attention, and his vast financial resources. Vanessa had a notorious habit of booking luxury spa weekends, private tennis lessons for Brielle, and extravagant catered dinner parties, then forwarding the exorbitant bills directly to Xavier. He always paid them without a single complaint, desperate to maintain his facade as the ultimate provider and the perfect, wealthy father. He frequently justified these massive expenses by claiming that keeping Vanessa happy was simply the cost of doing elite business in Washington. In reality, he was using stolen client funds to bankroll her ridiculous status-obsessed lifestyle, effectively making her a blind accomplice to his massive federal crimes. You are demanding that I cancel our 5th anniversary trip so you can go on a tropical vacation with your ex-wife, I asked, intentionally keeping my tone completely flat and analytical. Xavier rolled his eyes and scoffed, walking over to his custom walk-in closet to pull out a massive leather duffel bag. Do not make this a big deal, Vivian. It is a strict parenting obligation. Vanessa comes from a very prominent family, and she expects a certain level of elite involvement from me. Besides, I already paid for the presidential suite on the ship for the 3 of us. It is completely finalized. I make the money in this house, so I make the rules. I slowly walked over to my suitcase and zipped it shut, not to unpack my belongings, but to close them away securely. You make the money, I repeated softly, prompting him to keep talking. He pulled out a stack of linen resort shirts and tossed them carelessly onto the bed. Yes, Vivian, I make the money. I manage multi-million-dollar portfolios for the absolute elite of the city. You are just a tax clerk. You spend your days crunching meaningless receipts for mom and pop grocery stores. You would not possibly understand the immense pressure of my corporate world or the heavy expectations placed on a man of my caliber. He turned around and smirked, looking me up and down, taking in my simple black slacks and modest beige blouse. You have always been far too simple to grasp the complex machinations of real wealth management. He loved throwing around corporate buzzwords to make himself feel invincible. For the past 8 months, my firm had been secretly contracted by the board of directors at his very own wealth management company to conduct a massive internal audit. Tens of millions of dollars had mysteriously vanished from their highest-earning client portfolios. Xavier thought he was a mastermind funneling stolen assets through elaborate shell companies located in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. He honestly believed his digital footprints were completely untraceable. He assumed the regulatory agencies were too slow and too bureaucratic to ever catch up with his brilliant financial maneuvers. He was wrong. I had personally tracked every single fraudulent transaction, mapping his entire money laundering syndicate right from the comfort of our shared home network. I knew about the fake invoices he generated, the ghost employees he put on the payroll, and the massive kickbacks he secretly funneled to his brother-in-law Spencer. Just stay home, relax, and maybe catch up on your little accounting, continuing education credits while I am gone, Xavier said, his voice dripping with condescension. The sheer audacity of his words was staggering, yet completely aligned with the dynamic he had aggressively forced upon us for years. He thrived on his golden boy syndrome, a toxic mindset constantly validated by his mother, Geraldine. She never missed an opportunity at Sunday dinners to remind me that Vanessa belonged to an exclusive social circle, while I was just an ordinary woman who should consider herself incredibly lucky to have married into their wealthy family. They all genuinely believed I spent my days verifying mundane tax returns in a drab, windowless cubicle. They mistook my strategic silence for weak submission and my deliberate modesty for poverty. Xavier aggressively zipped his heavy leather duffel bag closed, slinging the strap over his broad shoulder. I will have my assistant wire you a few $100s so you can order some nice delivery dinners while I am away, he offered, throwing a pathetic, insulting crumb of financial consolation my way. Do not wait up for me. My flight to Miami leaves in 3 hours, and the cruise departs the harbor early tomorrow morning. He confidently walked out of our master bedroom without a single backward glance, without a hug, without a kiss. Goodbye, leaving me standing alone in the quiet aftermath of his blatant, unapologetic disrespect. 30 minutes later, my phone vibrated loudly on the wooden nightstand. I picked it up to see a text message from Xavier, most likely sent from the back of his private black car service on his way to the airport. My daughter needs both her parents there. Sorry you do not understand that, since we do not have kids. That specific calculated jab was maliciously designed to hurt me. It was a cruel reminder of my supposed inadequacy, perfectly echoing the exact insults his mother Geraldine regularly threw at my face during family holidays. But I did not shed a single tear. I did not throw objects across the room, nor did I scream into a pillow. I simply smiled. A slow, deeply chilling smile that reached all the way to my watchful eyes. I calmly walked over to my modern desk and opened my personal laptop. I bypassed the standard visual login screen and rapidly typed in a complex sequence of highly encrypted passwords. The screen immediately transitioned from a generic standard desktop background to a secure, highly classified federal dashboard. The official seal of the United States Department of Justice gleamed brightly in the center of the high-definition monitor, surrounded by incredibly complex wire transfer maps, offshore banking ledgers, and intricate forensic data trails tracking millions of missing dollars. I picked up my phone and drafted a reply to Xavier's arrogant text message. "Enjoy the ocean breeze. Just remember, international waters do not protect you from federal jurisdiction." I watched the delivery receipt, confirmed that he had received the message. I knew the exact second he read my words, because the typing indicator bubble quickly appeared, abruptly disappeared, and then left nothing but utter terrified silence. Suddenly, the doorbell of my townhouse rang, echoing through the empty hallway. I closed the encrypted laptop, smoothed out my simple beige blouse, and walked gracefully down the stairs. When I opened the heavy front door, a tall man in a sharp charcoal suit immediately flashed his federal badge. He was a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. "Good afternoon, Chief," the agent said, respectfully lowering his badge. "We have the warrants officially approved by the federal judge. Are we ready to freeze the offshore accounts, ma'am?" I leaned casually against the doorframe, looking out at the quiet, affluent street where my husband thought he ruled the world. "Let him board the ship first," I instructed coldly. "Let him get comfortable in that presidential suite with Vanessa. I want him trapped in international waters when he finally realizes every single dollar he embezzled has been seized." The agent nodded slowly, a professional smirk matching my own expression. "Checkmate," he murmured. I closed the heavy door, walked back up the stairs to my secure office, and prepared to systematically dismantle my husband's entire criminal empire. Every arrogant comment he had ever made, every time his family had belittled my career, and every dollar he had stolen to impress his ex-wife would now serve as the foundational evidence for his upcoming federal indictment. He wanted to play the role of the untouchable golden boy while treating me like an insignificant peasant. He was about to learn the hardest lesson of his life. The quiet, ordinary tax clerk he had so casually dismissed was actually the architect of his total destruction. The dominoes were perfectly lined up, the financial traps were fully set, and the illusion of his perfect life was about to be shattered beyond repair. He had abandoned our marriage for a luxury cruise, completely unaware that he had just booked a one-way ticket to federal prison. 72 hours before that moment at the front door, my husband and his family had laid the groundwork for their own destruction during our traditional Sunday family dinner. We were at the sprawling estate of my mother-in-law, Geraldine. Her home in an exclusive gated community in Maryland was a monument to the image she desperately wanted to project to the world. Everything was draped in heavy velvet and polished mahogany, smelling faintly of expensive floral arrangements and old money pretension. I remember walking into the grand dining room, carrying a homemade dessert I had spent hours preparing only to be directed to the very end of the long dining table. The seating arrangement was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated display of hierarchy, designed to put me exactly where they felt I belonged. Vanessa was already seated in the place of honor directly to the right of Geraldine. She was wearing a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, smiling that practiced society smile that made everyone in the room fawn over her. My husband Xavier sat right next to her with their teenage daughter Brielle, wedged comfortably between them. To anyone looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows, it appeared as though Vanessa was still the lady of the house, while I was merely a distant relative invited out of pity. I took my seat quietly, observing the way Geraldine hovered over Vanessa. When the food was brought out, the blatant disrespect began. Geraldine personally carved the roast, taking the most tender, succulent center cuts and placing them gently onto Vanessa's gold-rimmed plate. Geraldine did not even look in my direction as she passed the remaining tough-end pieces down the table toward me. She raised her crystal wineglass and smiled warmly at her former daughter-in-law. "Vanessa, darling," she purred, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "I was telling all my friends at the country club about the charity gala you hosted for the Jack and Jill Society last weekend. It was absolutely breathtaking. That is exactly the kind of Black excellence our family represents. We need women who know how to uphold our legacy and protect our social standing." Geraldine then let her eyes slide down the length of the table until they rested on me. Her smile vanished, replaced by a thin line of absolute condescension. "Tell me, Vivian, are you still punching a clock at that little bookkeeping office downtown? It must be so exhausting tallying up receipts for dry cleaners and grocery stores all day." I kept my face perfectly smooth, resting my hands softly in my lap. I did not tell her that the little bookkeeping office was actually a highly secure suite of forensic accounting laboratories. I did not mention that the receipts I tallied were actually complex webs of international money laundering schemes for the Department of Justice. Let her think I was ordinary. Let her believe I was small. I simply took a sip of my lemon water and nodded quietly. I told her that it pays the bills and keeps me busy. Before the conversation could move forward, Spencer decided to inject himself into the dynamic. Spencer was my sister-in-law, Tanya's husband, a white man who worked as a senior director at Xavier's wealth management firm. He possessed a staggering amount of unearned confidence, always walking around with a smug half-smile as if he owned the very air we breathed. He leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. "Do not stress her out, Mama G," he chuckled, using the nickname he felt entitled to use despite his glaring lack of respect for the culture of the house. "Math is hard, especially when you are just dealing with nickels and dimes all day." Spencer looked at me with an expression that dripped with white privilege and gendered superiority. "You should just leave the heavy financial lifting to Xavier and me, Vivian. We actually just closed a massive portfolio deal last week, moving more capital in one afternoon than your little office sees in a decade. Why do you not just focus on keeping Xavier's kitchen clean and making sure his suits are pressed for the work week? The business world is too complicated for someone with your background anyway." Tanya giggled beside him, resting her hand on his arm as if he had just delivered the most brilliant piece of comedy she had ever heard. Xavier did not defend me. He did not ask his brother-in-law to show some respect to his wife. He simply took another bite of his food and agreed. "Spencer is right, Vivian," he said. "You really do not need to concern yourself with how the real money is made in this family. Just be grateful you get to enjoy the benefits of my hard work and success." The sheer arrogance radiating from the two men was almost suffocating. I felt the sharp sting of anger flare deep in my chest, but I forced it down, locking it away behind years of professional composure. I knew that reacting emotionally would only give them the satisfaction of calling me an angry or bitter woman. My silence was my armor. I had spent my entire adult life learning how to read the hidden stories behind numbers, how to spot the subtle arrogance of men who thought they were smarter than the systems they manipulated. They all assumed my quiet nature meant I was oblivious. They could not fathom that I was silently analyzing their spending habits, their nervous tics, and their desperate need to flaunt their wealth. Instead of arguing, I placed my linen napkin on the table and stood up slowly. I told the table I was going to the kitchen to get some more ice for my drink. I walked away from the sound of their self-congratulatory laughter, my heels making absolutely no sound against the thick Persian rugs in the hallway. Geraldine's kitchen was a massive chef-grade space located just past a heavy set of swinging wooden doors. The air inside smelled of roasted garlic and expensive vanilla candles. I walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator and reached for the ice dispenser. As I pushed the glass against the lever, I froze. Xavier and Spencer were not in the dining room anymore. They had slipped out through the patio doors and were standing just outside the kitchen window, entirely unaware that the glass was cracked open to let in the cool evening breeze. Their previously smug voices were now hushed and frantic, laced with the undeniable edge of raw panic. "Did you wire the $850,000 to the shell company in the Caymans?" Spencer asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "I am telling you, Xavier, if the feds look at the ledger and see that missing capital, we are both doing federal time. I cannot afford a mistake right now. We have to be absolutely certain the paper trail is completely wiped clean before the quarterly review happens next month." I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the kitchen, holding my breath. My mind immediately shifted from being a neglected wife to being a federal contractor. The numbers aligned perfectly with the discrepancies I had already been tracking on their corporate accounts. My husband let out a harsh, dismissive sigh that sounded far less confident than it had at the dinner table. "Relax," Spencer Xavier muttered, pacing back and forth on the stone patio outside. "You worry way too much about this. I already took care of the transfer this morning. I hid the entire amount under Vanessa's new luxury villa purchase in the Bahamas. The escrow documents are totally fabricated to look like a standard overseas real estate investment. No one is going to question a high net worth society woman buying a vacation home on the beach. It is the perfect cover, and it keeps the money safe until things cool down." Spencer still sounded completely unconvinced. "What about your wife?" he asked, pacing the stone tiles alongside Xavier. "What if she sees a bank statement or notices the shift in your personal assets? She is an accountant, even if she is just a low-level one. She might ask questions if she sees documents lying around the house." Xavier laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that echoed through the open window and pierced straight through my chest. "My dumb wife will not notice a single thing," he sneered. "She is too busy folding my laundry and worrying about making her little homemade pies to understand high-level corporate fraud. She trusts me completely and blindly. She does not have the capacity to look beyond her own nose when it comes to real finance. I have her perfectly trained to look the other way." I stood in the dim light of the kitchen, feeling a strange, profound calmness wash over my entire body. The pain of his betrayal was instantly eclipsed by the cold, calculating instinct of a predator who had just successfully cornered its prey. He thought I was blind. He thought I was docile. He genuinely believed that my devotion to our marriage meant I was too stupid to see the financial crimes he was committing right under my roof. I raised my left wrist and tapped the digital face of my Apple Watch, activating the high-fidelity voice recording application I had specifically installed for covert fieldwork. I captured every single word of their conversation right through the open window. I captured the exact amount of stolen funds, the specific location of the offshore shell company, and his explicit admission of using his ex-wife as a financial shield to hide his embezzlement. I listened as they continued to discuss their illegal activities, congratulating each other on outsmarting the system. They spoke about how they would gradually siphon more money over the next year, funding their extravagant lifestyles while leaving their clients completely oblivious. Every word they spoke was another nail in their legal coffins. My heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I was no longer just the woman they mocked at the dinner table. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I carefully stopped the recording and saved the encrypted audio file directly to my secure cloud server. The evidence was completely locked down and ready to be processed by my team at the Department of Justice. I filled my glass with ice, letting the cubes clink softly against the glass. I took a deep breath, smoothing my features back into the pleasant, unassuming mask of the ordinary wife they all believed me to be. I pushed through the swinging wooden doors and walked back into the grand dining room. Geraldine was still praising Vanessa, and Brielle was still ignoring my existence. I sat back down in my chair at the very end of the table and took a sip of my cold water. Xavier and Spencer returned a few moments later, taking their seats with relaxed smiles, as if they had just been discussing sports on the patio. Xavier looked at me and asked if I had managed to find the ice. I smiled back at him, looking directly into his arrogant eyes. I told him, yes, I found exactly what I was looking for. They continued to eat and laugh, completely unaware that the countdown to their total ruin had officially begun. The transition from my quiet suburban townhouse to the beating heart of downtown Washington District of Columbia was a drive I made with absolute precision. After the federal agent left my porch, I did not linger in the empty house that Xavier thought he controlled. I walked out to my understated sedan and drove toward the financial district, leaving the illusion of the meek tax clerk far behind me in the rearview mirror. The city streets blurred past me as I navigated through the heavy afternoon traffic, the monuments and government buildings serving as a familiar backdrop to my true life. My actual destination was a towering structure of glass and steel located just 3 blocks from the Department of Justice. This building did not house small-time bookkeeping operations or ordinary tax preparers. It was the heavily guarded headquarters of my elite forensic accounting firm. I had built this empire from the ground up over the last 10 years, entirely in the shadows, away from the probing eyes of high society. My name was not plastered on the exterior brickwork, and my face was never featured in glossy business magazines. Stealth was my ultimate currency, and anonymity was my greatest weapon. I pulled into my reserved underground parking space and took the private express elevator directly to the top floor. The doors opened to a sleek, high-tech corridor bathed in cool blue LED lighting. There were no receptionists to offer cheerful greetings and no comfortable waiting areas for casual clients. Instead, I placed my hand on a biometric scanner and looked directly into the retinal lens. The heavy, reinforced glass doors slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, revealing a sprawling operations center that looked significantly more like a federal intelligence hub than a financial firm. Dozens of brilliant analysts, engineers, and former federal agents sat behind massive curved monitors, tracking the digital blood trails of the most corrupt executives in the country. The low hum of server towers and the quiet tapping of keyboards filled the massive room with an atmosphere of intense focus. I walked confidently across the polished floor, the air buzzing with the quiet intensity of high-stakes corporate warfare. My lead investigator, Marcus, approached me immediately, holding a secure encrypted tablet tightly against his chest. He briefed me in low, rapid tones as we walked toward the main glass-enclosed conference room. The board of directors at Xavier's wealth management firm had officially signed off on our final authorization protocols earlier that morning. They had hired us 6 months ago in absolute secrecy when their internal risk management algorithms detected a massive, terrifying hemorrhage of client capital. The board knew they were bleeding tens of millions of dollars, but their traditional auditors were completely blind to the sophisticated extraction methods being used by the perpetrators. They needed a phantom agency to find the leak without alerting the criminals operating within their own ranks. They needed me and my unparalleled team of financial ghost hunters. We entered the main conference room, where 3 senior agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation were already seated around a massive dark mahogany table. They stood up respectfully as I walked in, acknowledging my ultimate authority in this joint operation. I took my place at the head of the table, pressing a discreet button on the console to lower the privacy blinds and activate the wall-sized digital display. The massive screen flickered to life, showing a complex illuminated web of international wire transfers, shell company registries, and offshore banking coordinates. Right in the dead center of this massive criminal spiderweb was my husband's name, accompanied by the corporate administrative credentials of his brother-in-law Spencer. Gentlemen, I began, my voice calm and completely devoid of any marital sentiment or emotional fragility. The target has officially taken the bait and is currently in motion. He is en route to the Miami port and firmly believes his latest extraction of $850,000 has successfully bypassed the internal security firewalls of his firm. I tapped my tablet, bringing up the exact high-fidelity audio recording I had captured from my kitchen window 72 hours ago. I played the hushed, panicked voices of Xavier and Spencer for the federal agents, letting the clear, undeniable admission of their massive guilt echo through the quiet conference room. The FBI lead agent smiled a tight, professional smile, noting that Xavier's own boundless arrogance had just handed them the final incontrovertible piece of the prosecutorial puzzle. I proceeded to explain the mechanics of Xavier's latest fraud with clinical detachment, breaking down the 3 stages of his money laundering operation. He was systematically siphoning capital from elderly high-net-worth clients who rarely checked their daily portfolio balances, trusting the firm implicitly. During the placement phase, he would route those stolen funds through a series of phantom vendor invoices that Spencer intentionally approved on the corporate back-end, using his privileged administrative access. Once the money was layered and washed through their own firm, it was wired directly to a holding company completely hidden in the Cayman Islands. But Xavier was not just hiding the money in stagnant accounts. He was actively integrating it back into the economy through high-end real estate purchases deliberately designed to look like legitimate overseas investments for his high-society ex-wife. As I was methodically walking the federal agents through the specific routing numbers of the Cayman accounts, my personal cell phone began to vibrate loudly against the polished conference table. The caller ID displayed an incoming FaceTime request from Vanessa. The timing was absolutely perfect, almost poetic in its cruelty. I held up a hand signaling the highly trained agents to remain completely silent and out of the camera's view. I accepted the video call and kept my expression pleasantly neutral, wearing the perfect mask of the oblivious and discarded wife left behind in the suburbs. Vanessa's face instantly filled the high-definition screen. She was standing in the chaotic, bustling terminal of the luxury cruise port in sunny Miami. The overwhelming noise of thousands of wealthy vacationers rolling heavy luggage and shouting over booming intercoms created a loud, vibrant background of privileged chaos. Vanessa was wearing a designer silk resort cover-up oversized dark sunglasses that hid half her face and a wide-brimmed straw sun hat. She looked the absolute picture of the high society social climber she so desperately pretended to be. Directly behind her, I could clearly see the massive white hull of the luxury cruise ship waiting patiently to carry her away into international waters. "Oh," Vanessa practically sang into the phone, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness and deep-rooted poisonous condescension. "I just wanted to call and say thank you so much for graciously lending me your husband for the next 2 weeks. It must be so terribly lonely and depressing for you sitting in that quiet little house all by yourself while we set sail for absolute paradise." I did not let a single ounce of anger or betrayal touch my face. I simply tilted my head slightly and told her in a soft voice that I genuinely hoped they had a safe and pleasant journey across the ocean. My calm, unassuming demeanor only seemed to furiously agitate her desire to inflict emotional pain. She dramatically lowered her expensive sunglasses, peering at the camera with a look of pure, malicious triumph. She wanted to ensure beyond any shadow of a doubt that I knew exactly where I stood in the rigid hierarchy of Xavier's life. "You know, Vivian, a truly powerful and successful man like Xavier really needs a true society woman," standing proudly by his side. Vanessa gloated, shifting her phone to explicitly show off a massive stack of matching custom designer luggage waiting to be boarded onto the ship. "He deeply needs a woman who inherently understands Black excellence, who knows exactly how to navigate prestigious country clubs and elite charity galas without embarrassing him. He absolutely does not need a simple, quiet maid who just balances a small checkbook and waits obediently by the front door every evening. You really should learn to accept and know your proper place in his magnificent world. You are just a temporary placeholder until he fully realizes the incredible family he truly lost." I let her toxic words wash over me completely unbothered by her pathetic and transparent attempt at psychological warfare. As a forensic profiler, I saw right through her. She was a deeply insecure woman whose entire identity and fragile self-worth were desperately tied to the money she could extract from a wealthy man. She had absolutely no real power of her own, possessing only the grand illusion of generational wealth, built entirely on a foundation of stolen client funds. I asked her if she was looking forward to exploring the Bahamas, keeping my tone completely conversational and politely light, as if we were just two old friends catching up on weekend plans. Vanessa's smile grew even wider, showing all of her perfectly veneered teeth as she took the bait completely. She leaned intimately into the camera, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial brag that was meant to crush my spirit. The Bahamas are going to be absolutely life-changing, Vivian. Xavier is not just taking us on a simple luxury cruise for a few weeks. He is actually finalizing the purchase of a gorgeous $2 million beachfront villa strictly for me and Brielle this very weekend. He wanted to make absolutely sure that the mother of his precious child has a permanent sanctuary that accurately reflects her true immense worth. Do not be too terribly jealous, Vivian. Some women are just naturally born to be spoiled like royalty, and some women are sadly just born to serve in the background. Please try to enjoy your little boring desk job on Monday morning while I am sipping mimosas on my private balcony. Vanessa abruptly ended the call before I could utter a single word in response, leaving my phone screen completely black. I slowly and deliberately placed my phone back onto the smooth mahogany table. The seasoned FBI agents in the room were staring at me in absolute stunned silence. They had just witnessed my husband's ex-wife directly and voluntarily confess to receiving millions of dollars in stolen assets purchased through elaborate international wire fraud, and she had done it while actively mocking the very federal contractor hired to ensure she went to federal prison. It was a masterclass in profound criminal ignorance. I did not get mad. I did not let the vicious insult shatter my professional composure for even a fraction of a second. Instead, I smoothly turned my attention back to the massive digital display glowing brightly on the wall. I swiped my hand across the glass control interface, bringing up a highly classified monitoring program that my elite software engineers had specifically built for this exact monumental moment. The massive screen displayed the pending $2 million real estate transaction that Xavier had eagerly initiated from his hidden offshore account just hours ago. He genuinely thought he was wiring the embezzled money directly to a legitimate, highly respected Bahamian real estate escrow firm to finalize the paperwork. He truly thought the purchase of Vanessa's luxury villa was going to be the ultimate untraceable flex of his ill-gotten wealth, an arrogant monument to his supposed untouchable brilliance. He was completely and fundamentally wrong on every conceivable level. I zoomed in closely on the encrypted routing details of the receiving account, illuminating the numbers for the agents to see clearly. The account Xavier was currently using to buy the beachfront villa was not a real escrow account at all. It was an incredibly sophisticated Internal Revenue Service honeypot account that I had personally engineered and secretly set up several weeks ago. Using my deep access to his home network, I had quietly intercepted the original real estate communications between Xavier and the island brokers. I then seamlessly replaced the legitimate offshore wiring instructions with heavily disguised federal depository coordinates. To Xavier and his corrupt network of bankers, the digital portal looked exactly like a standard secure Caribbean property holding account. In reality, the server receiving his stolen millions was located directly in the secure basement of the United States Department of the Treasury. The digital trap was flawlessly laid out before us, completely invisible to the arrogant man walking onto that cruise ship. All the stolen money Xavier was currently attempting to move to secure Vanessa's extravagant lifestyle and prove his ultimate superiority was sitting in a temporary digital purgatory, waiting patiently for final administrative authorization to clear the banking network. I looked over at the lead FBI agent, who gave me a firm, resolute nod of absolute approval, recognizing the sheer genius of the tactical snare we had deployed. I placed my fingers gently over my encrypted keyboard, feeling the cool, smooth surface of the mechanical keys beneath my fingertips. This was the exact culmination of months of grueling, sleepless investigative work. I was not just taking down a cheating, disrespectful husband who threw away our anniversary trip. I was dismantling a massive, destructive syndicate of white-collar crime and aggressively protecting the life savings and pensions of innocent, vulnerable clients who had trusted Xavier's prestigious firm. I steadily typed in my final, highly secure administrative override code, effectively unlocking the holding pattern on the massive wire transfer. I slowly moved my cursor over the bright, glowing green approval button on the center of the screen. In that brief, solitary second, I thought about the way Geraldine had looked at me, with such pure, unadulterated disdain at the family dinner table, claiming I lacked black excellence. I thought about Spencer's exceptionally smug and arrogant face as he completely dismissed my intelligence based entirely on my gender and his blinding white privilege. I thought about Vanessa loudly bragging from the crowded cruise terminal, completely oblivious to the devastating fact that her precious, unearned social status was entirely funded by massive federal felonies. And finally, I thought about Xavier, the man who genuinely believed he could casually toss our anniversary tickets in the bedroom trash and boldly finance a lavish secret life with stolen millions, while repeatedly treating me like an uneducated servant in my own sanctuary. I clicked the mouse. The massive wall screen immediately flashed with a brilliant, undeniable red notification. The transaction was fully executed. The $850,000 Xavier had originally stolen, along with the rest of the massive capital required for the $2 million villa, slammed directly into the federal honeypot with incredible digital force. The sophisticated trap snapped shut with absolute terrifying finality. The illicit funds were instantly frozen, seized, and permanently locked into federal custody, where Xavier could never reach them again. He no longer had access to a single solitary penny of his hidden offshore wealth. His secret accounts were completely drained, leaving a pristine, indisputable digital blood trail leading straight from his corporate desk to his inevitable federal indictment. I sat back deeply in my leather chair, crossing my arms confidently, as the secure government network confirmed the total absolute seizure of all related criminal assets. Xavier was now floating blindly on a massive luxury cruise ship, heading straight into international waters, completely unaware that he had just bought his arrogant ex-wife a phantom villa with a one-way, non-refundable ticket to a federal penitentiary. The red notification on my secure monitor slowly faded into a steady, pulsing green light, confirming that the massive sum of $850,000 was now permanently locked inside the federal treasury servers. I sat back in my ergonomic leather chair and allowed myself a single deep breath. Xavier was officially trapped. He was floating somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, drinking expensive champagne and bragging to his ex-wife about a luxury villa that he was never going to own. The financial cage had been completely sealed around him, but my meticulous work was far from over. Xavier was the head of the snake, but the venom had infected his entire family. I closed the encrypted laptop and locked it away inside my biometric safe, just as a loud, aggressive pounding echoed through the quiet hallway of my townhouse. It was not the polite, measured knock of a delivery driver or a friendly neighbor. It was the entitled, demanding pounding of someone who believed they owned the very ground they walked on. I smoothed down the front of my simple beige blouse and walked calmly down the stairs. When I pulled the heavy wooden front door open, I was immediately shoved backward as my mother-in-law Geraldine barged into my home without waiting for an invitation. She was followed closely by my sister-in-law Tanya, who was busy examining her fresh acrylic nails as she stepped over my threshold. Geraldine was wearing a vibrant tailored suit that she had undoubtedly charged to one of Xavier's credit cards, while Tanya clutched a brightly colored designer handbag that I knew for a fact cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. They carried the distinct scent of expensive department store perfume and absolute arrogance into my private sanctuary. I closed the door behind them, keeping my face completely blank. Neither of them bothered to offer a greeting. Instead, Geraldine marched directly into my kitchen, her heels striking the hardwood floor with deliberate, heavy steps. She dropped a thick, glossy folder onto my pristine granite island with a loud, sharp smack. I walked into the kitchen and stood across the island from them, looking down at the folder. Geraldine crossed her arms over her chest and glared at me with eyes full of absolute contempt. She demanded that I open the folder and fix the massive problem that had just embarrassed her in front of half the city. I slowly opened the cover and found a heavily itemized invoice from the most exclusive event planning company in Washington. The total balance due at the bottom of the page was exactly $40,000. It was the final billing statement for Brielle's upcoming Sweet 16 birthday party. I looked up at Geraldine, waiting for the inevitable demand. She leaned forward, her voice dripping with irritation. She explained that she and Tanya had just been at the event planner's downtown office to finalize the floral arrangements and the custom catering menu. When they tried to process the final payment using the platinum card Xavier had left for them, the transaction was declined. They had tried running the card 3 separate times, only to be humiliated in front of the elite party planners when the bank completely locked the account. They blamed a bank error, completely unaware that I was the one who had initiated the federal freeze on Xavier's stolen assets just 30 minutes prior. Geraldine slammed her hand against the granite countertop, demanding that I resolve the issue immediately. She told me that Xavier was out of reach in international waters, and that she refused to let Vanessa and Brielle down because of some stupid banking glitch. She looked me dead in the eye and delivered her ultimate command. She told me to pay the $40,000 invoice right now. I stared at her, letting the sheer audacity of her demand hang in the quiet air of my kitchen. I asked her how exactly she expected me to cover a $40,000 party bill on a tax clerk's modest salary. Geraldine scoffed, rolling her eyes, as if my financial limitations were a personal insult to her. She stepped closer and delivered a blow designed to completely shatter my spirit. She told me that she knew I had a small retirement fund sitting in some pathetic little bank account. She demanded that I cash it out immediately. She leaned in close, her voice dripping with toxic venom, and told me that paying for her granddaughter's lavish birthday party was my absolute duty as a woman, since my body was too broken and useless to give her son a real child of my own. The cruelty of her words was meant to break me. For years, Geraldine had used my infertility as a weapon, swinging it at me whenever she felt I needed to be reminded of my supposedly inferior place in her family. She loved elevating Vanessa, the mother of the golden grandchild, while reducing me to a barren disappointment who was lucky Xavier had not thrown me away. Before I could even process the maliciousness of her demand, Tanya decided to pile onto the humiliation. Tanya began pacing around my kitchen, running her fingers over my modest appliances and sighing dramatically. She laughed a sharp, mocking sound and pointed out the window toward the driveway. She told me that I clearly did not need any savings since I drove a boring, dependable hybrid sedan, while Vanessa was being driven around in luxury SUVs. Tanya picked up one of my plain ceramic coffee mugs and sneered, asking why I chose to live like a peasant when I was married to a king. She mocked my lack of visible designer labels, my simple clothes, and my quiet lifestyle. She told me that women who could not provide heirs at least needed to provide financial utility. She laughed and said that cashing out my retirement was the absolute least I could do to justify taking up space in Xavier's beautiful home. Tanya was completely and utterly blind to the reality surrounding her. She looked at my simple clothes and saw poverty. She looked at my quiet demeanor and saw weakness. She did not possess the intellectual capacity to understand that true wealth does not need to scream for attention. The house they were currently standing in, the very roof over their heads, was secretly owned by my private holding company. My dependable sedan was a strategic choice to avoid standing out during covert federal surveillance operations. My plain clothing allowed me to blend into any corporate boardroom undetected. They thought they were dealing with an uneducated, fragile housewife who was desperately clinging to her husband's coattails. They had absolutely no idea that my personal net worth eclipsed Xavier's entirely legitimate and illegitimate funds combined. They had no idea that I was currently wearing a watch that could monitor their heart rates and record their voices for a federal indictment. I absorbed every single insult, every mocking laugh, and every cruel jab about my fertility, without letting a single emotion show on my face. I was not a victim. I was a predator patiently observing my prey walking willingly into a fatal trap. I looked down at the $40,000 invoice resting on the granite island. I did not argue with Geraldine about my retirement fund. I did not cry over her vicious comments regarding my lack of children. I simply nodded my head, letting a look of defeated resignation wash over my features. I told them that I would take care of the payment. Geraldine smirked, exchanging a triumphant look with Tanya. They genuinely believed they had just successfully bullied me into financial ruin. I turned around and walked over to my leather tote bag resting on the entryway table. I slowly unzipped the main compartment and pulled out my simple black leather wallet. Tanya crossed her arms and let out a loud, dramatic sigh, complaining about how long this was taking and how they had a strict lunch reservation at the country club to get to. I ignored her whining and opened my wallet. I bypassed the standard debit cards and the basic credit cards that I used for everyday cover purchases. Instead, I slid my fingers into a hidden back slot and slowly pulled out a heavy, solid titanium card. It was an exclusive invitation, only black card. A financial instrument reserved strictly for individuals with verified 8-figure banking portfolios. There were no limits on this card. It was not tied to Xavier. It was tied directly to my highly successful forensic accounting empire. As the heavy metal card caught the light, Tanya's eyes widened in absolute shock. She was a woman whose entire existence revolved around recognizing and coveting elite status symbols. She knew exactly what that card was, and she knew that ordinary tax clerks absolutely did not carry them. Her mouth fell open slightly and she took a step toward the island, staring at the black metal in my hand. Geraldine frowned, clearly confused by Tanya's sudden silence, but she remained oblivious to the profound financial weight of the object I was holding. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number for the elite event planning company listed at the top of the invoice. I placed the phone on the kitchen counter and turned on the speakerphone, allowing the loud ringing to echo through the room. A polite professional voice answered the line immediately, apologizing profusely for the earlier payment issues with Mr. Xavier's account. I spoke in a clear, authoritative tone, instructing the coordinator that I would be clearing the outstanding $40,000 balance immediately using an alternate account. I read the numbers off the heavy titanium card methodically and precisely. The coordinator punched the numbers into her terminal. There was a brief moment of silence, followed by a sharp intake of breath from the woman on the other end of the line. The payment was instantly approved without a single second of hesitation. The coordinator practically tripped over her own words, thanking me profusely and promising that Brielle's Sweet 16 would be the absolute event of the season. I told her to email the final receipt directly to my personal account and calmly ended the call. I slipped the black card back into my simple wallet and looked up at my mother-in-law and sister-in-law. Geraldine let out a loud, satisfied huff, completely ignoring the implications of the card I had just used. She snatched the paid invoice off the granite counter and shoved it roughly into her purse. She told me that it was about time I made myself useful to the family and reminded me to ensure the kitchen was spotless before Xavier returned from his cruise. Tanya, however, was still staring at me with a profound, deeply unsettling mixture of confusion and sudden, terrifying realization. The arrogant smirk had completely melted off her face, replaced by a nervous, calculating gaze. She opened her mouth to ask a question, but Geraldine grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the front door, complaining that they were going to be late for their mimosa brunch. I followed them to the entryway, watching silently as they stepped back out into the bright afternoon sun. Geraldine turned around on the porch, flashing me one last look of absolute supreme arrogance before turning her back and walking down the driveway. I closed the heavy wooden door and locked the deadbolt. I walked back into the quiet kitchen and picked up my secure phone. They walked away, gloating, thinking they had just successfully drained my life savings to fund their extravagant, status-obsessed lifestyle. They thought they had put the quiet, ordinary maid back in her proper place. But they did not understand the federal banking laws regarding money laundering and criminal enterprise. by demanding that I pay that specific invoice for an event organized and hosted by Vanessa, using funds directly connected to Xavier's frozen offshore empire. They had just permanently attached their own names to the financial paper trail. The party planner, Vanessa, Geraldine, and Tanya, were now all legally bound together in the massive federal indictment I was building. They were no longer just arrogant in-laws. They had just willingly and aggressively made themselves active co-conspirators in a federal wire fraud investigation. I poured myself a fresh glass of cold water and took a long, slow sip. The Sweet 16 was going to be an unforgettable party indeed. The silence in my townhouse was heavy and deliberate after Geraldine and Tanya finally took their toxic energy back to the suburbs. I remained standing in the center of my kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. I had just successfully linked the matriarch of the family to a massive federal investigation with a single swipe of a black card. The board was set, and the opening moves had been executed with flawless precision. But I knew the financial bleeding I had caused by freezing Xavier's offshore accounts would quickly trigger alarms among his co-conspirators. Xavier was isolated on a cruise ship, unable to fix the frozen assets. That meant the panic would inevitably fall squarely onto the shoulders of the man left behind to manage the burning empire. I did not have to wait long for the next rat to scurry into my trap. 24 hours later, the low, aggressive rumble of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet peace of my residential street. I was sitting in my living room, reviewing a set of encrypted files on my secondary monitor, when I heard the heavy car doors slam shut. I walked to the front window and peered through the wooden blinds. Spencer was strutting up my front walkway, wearing a tailored navy suit that fit a little too snugly around his shoulders. He checked his reflection in the glass of my front door, smoothing back his perfectly gelled hair, before ringing the doorbell with a series of sharp, impatient taps. I took a deep breath, letting my shoulders drop and softening my posture to project the image of a defeated and heartbroken woman. I opened the door and offered him a weak, hesitant smile. Spencer did not wait for an invitation to enter. He simply pushed past me, carrying a thick leather briefcase and bringing the overwhelming scent of peppermint and expensive cologne into my home. He looked around my modest living room with a familiar expression of deep, unearned superiority. "Well, Vivian," he said, letting out a heavy sigh, as if simply being in my presence was a tremendous burden. "You certainly have managed to make quite a mess of things while Xavier is away." I closed the front door and followed him into the dining room, keeping my head slightly bowed. I asked him what he meant playing the role of the confused and desperate wife to absolute perfection. Spencer dropped his heavy briefcase onto my dining table and unclasped the brass locks with a sharp snap. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. He did not look at me with sympathy or kindness. He looked at me the way a real estate developer looks at a condemned building standing in the way of a lucrative project. He leaned his hands on the table and stared me down. "Xavier's credit cards are declining all over the city, Vivian," he stated, his voice cold and accusatory. "Geraldine told me about the little stunt you pulled with the event planner yesterday. She said you used some secret account to pay the bill after freezing Xavier's access. I do not know what kind of petty marital revenge game you think you are playing, but you are messing with things you do not understand." I kept my hands folded tightly in front of me and told him that I was just trying to help the family. Spencer scoffed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You are not helping anyone, Vivian," he sneered. "You are just embarrassing yourself. Xavier called me from the ship using a satellite phone. He is completely done with this marriage. He is done with your quiet little passive-aggressive tantrums. He instructed me to come here and handle the legal separation of assets before this gets any uglier." Spencer slid the thick stack of papers across the polished wood of the dining table until they rested directly in front of me. He tapped a thick manicured finger against the signature line on the final page. The paperwork was a comprehensive waiver of assets. It was a draconian legal document, completely stripping me of any right to the house, the bank accounts, the retirement funds, and the investment portfolios. It offered a pathetic lump sum of $50,000 in exchange for my quiet and immediate departure from their lives. I stared at the papers, letting my eyes widen in manufactured shock. I let my lower lip tremble slightly, looking up at Spencer with wide, terrified eyes. I told him that I did not understand any of this, and that Xavier and I had built this life together. I watched his hands as he smoothed out the paperwork. His fingernails were perfectly manicured, gleaming under the dining room chandelier. It was such a stark contrast to the ugly, dirty nature of the crimes he committed every day. He wore his privilege like a heavy suit of armor, completely convinced that the rules governing ordinary citizens simply did not apply to his demographic. He spoke to me with a casual cruelty that suggested he viewed me as a minor logistical hurdle rather than a human being whose life was being upended. Spencer leaned in close, invading my personal space with his overwhelming entitlement. "Look, Viv," he said, his tone shifting into a patronizing growl. "Xavier is moving on. Sign this, take a small payout, and walk away. Guys like us, we own this city. Do not try to fight corporate money. You are just a simple bookkeeper. You do not have the resources, the pedigree, or the stamina to go to war with a wealth management firm. If you fight this, we will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the street. Take the generous offer Xavier is making and disappear quietly." His arrogant words hung heavily in the air, dripping with the absolute certainty of a mediocre white man who had spent his entire life failing upward. He genuinely believed that his gender, his skin color, and his corporate title made him an invincible god among mortals. He thought my silence was submission. He had no idea that my silence was actually a precise calculation of his imminent demise. I let a single tear slip down my cheek, wiping it away with a trembling hand. I practiced the exact physical manifestations of panic that I had studied during my federal interrogation training. I let my breathing become shallow and erratic. I clutched my hands together until my knuckles turned white. Spencer absorbed my performance, and his posture relaxed even further, his ego feeding hungrily on my manufactured despair. I looked down at the complicated legal jargon covering the pages and shook my head slowly. I told him that I could not sign something I did not understand. I told him that the numbers on the settlement offer did not make any sense to me because Xavier always handled the big accounts. I looked up at him pleadingly and asked if he could just show me the actual corporate asset portal. I told him that if I could just see the real numbers and understand how much debt Xavier was claiming we had, I might feel better about signing the waiver. Spencer rolled his eyes, clearly annoyed by my supposed intellectual limitations, but his inherent desire to show off his power and authority completely overrode his basic common sense. "Fine," Vivian, Spencer snapped, pulling a sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase. "I will show you the back-end ledgers so you can see exactly how little equity you actually have in this marriage." He opened the laptop and stared at the screen for a moment before letting out an irritated groan. He complained that he could not get a stable cellular signal to connect his secure corporate virtual private network. He muttered something about how typical it was that my neighborhood had such terrible infrastructure. When he complained about the cellular signal, a deep thrill of victory coursed through my veins. I had intentionally installed military-grade signal jammers within the walls of my dining room earlier that morning, specifically designed to block the exact frequencies used by his major corporate carrier. I knew that a man as impatient and arrogant as Spencer would never tolerate the minor inconvenience of a slow connection. He would demand an immediate solution, and I was more than ready to provide the poisoned apple. The trap was now completely primed and waiting for the final trigger. I offered him a helpful, innocent smile and pointed toward the small black router sitting discreetly on the bookshelf. I told him that the cell service was indeed terrible, but he was more than welcome to use my secure home network to explain the contract to me. I recited the password for him, spelling it out slowly, as if I were trying to be as accommodating as possible to the man who was currently trying to ruin my life. Spencer did not hesitate for a single second. His towering arrogance blinded him to the basic rules of digital security. He typed the password into his machine and connected his corporate device directly to my private network. He had absolutely no idea that the small black box on the bookshelf was not a standard residential internet router. It was a highly advanced military-grade network interceptor specifically configured by my federal forensic team. My home network was a masterpiece of digital deception. It broadcasted a generic standard service set identifier that looked identical to every other residential network on the block. But beneath that mundane surface lay a sophisticated routing protocol that mirrored every single packet of data transmitted through its channels directly to my secure forensic servers. The moment his laptop connected to my signal, my hidden servers immediately initiated a silent, invisible man in the middle attack. As Spencer confidently typed in his administrative username and his complex dual-factor authentication password, my system did not just capture his keystrokes. It successfully intercepted and duplicated the active encrypted session token directly from his corporate wealth management server. He had just handed me the master keys to the entire criminal kingdom without me ever having to write a single line of malicious code. Spencer proudly turned his screen toward me, pointing to a series of heavily manipulated spreadsheets that drastically undervalued Xavier's assets. He spent the next 10 minutes loudly explaining corporate finance to me, using small, simple words, as if he were teaching a toddler how to tie their shoes. I nodded along, acting completely overwhelmed by the numbers playing the role of the defeated wife perfectly. I asked a few simple questions just to keep him talking and to ensure the secure session remained active long enough for my servers to completely mirror his corporate access credentials. After he finished his condescending lecture, Spencer closed his laptop and shoved it back into his briefcase. He tapped the signature line on the waiver document one more time. He told me to take the night to read through the horrible deal and warned me that the offer would expire by tomorrow afternoon. He advised me not to do anything stupid like calling a cheap divorce lawyer who would only take the meager settlement money he was offering. He zipped his bag closed and strutted toward the front door, his chest puffed out with the supreme confidence of a man who believed he had just completely conquered a weak opponent. I followed him to the door, maintaining my quiet, submissive posture. He stepped out onto the porch and turned back to look at me one last time. He offered a cold, pitying smile and told me to be smart for once in my life. I watched in silence as he walked down the driveway, climbed into his loud sports car, and sped away down the quiet residential street. I stood in the open doorway until the sound of his engine completely faded into the distance. The moment his car rounded the corner, the trembling fear vanished entirely from my body, replaced by a sharp, chilling focus. I locked the front door and walked swiftly up the stairs to my secure home office. I bypassed the visual locks and woke up my massive dual monitors. The screen was no longer showing the quiet resting state of a standard computer. Right in the center of the brilliant high-definition display, a bright green terminal window was actively pulsing with glorious flowing data. The text at the bottom of the screen read in stark, undeniable letters, "Network breach. Successful admin credentials acquired." Spencer thought he had just bullied a helpless woman into walking away from her life. Instead, blinded entirely by his own colossal ego and white privilege, he had just unknowingly logged into the federal servers and handed me direct, unrestricted access to their highly encrypted offshore ledgers. The final invisible walls protecting their criminal empire had just completely crumbled, and I now possessed every single secret they had ever tried to hide. The bright green terminal window pulsed on my monitor, displaying the absolute surrender of Spencer's corporate firewall. I sat in the quiet hum of my home office, watching lines of encrypted data flood into the secure federal servers. Spencer had walked into my home reeking of cheap arrogance and unearned privilege, and he had just handed the Department of Justice the digital keys to the kingdom. My forensic team was already working on the incoming data stream, mapping out the intricate web of offshore accounts, shell companies, and phantom vendors that Xavier and Spencer had spent years building. It was a masterpiece of financial deception, but it was unraveling before my very eyes. I spent the next few hours meticulously tracing the flow of stolen capital. They had siphoned over $40 million from elderly clients' pension funds and private trusts. Every stolen dollar was neatly categorized and transferred to the Cayman Islands. They thought they were invisible gods of the financial world, but they were just common thieves wearing expensive suits. I did not sleep that night. The adrenaline of the hunt kept my mind sharp and my fingers moving across the keyboard. By the time the sun began to rise over the Washington skyline, the federal agents had successfully secured every single ledger. The trap was fully armed. The explosive charges were set, and all I needed now was for Xavier to strike the match. My dual monitors reflected the sheer magnitude of the criminal enterprise we had just acquired. Spencer had actually logged in with super administrator privileges, giving us unfettered access to their hidden communication channels, internal memos, and falsified tax returns. They were so blinded by their own hubris that they never once considered the possibility of a threat originating from inside their own family. They had spent years treating me like a piece of invisible furniture, completely failing to realize that I was quietly recording every single move they made. The opportunity for the final confrontation arrived late the next afternoon. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final asset forfeiture documents when my personal cell phone began to vibrate against the wood. The caller ID displayed a satellite number routing through a maritime network. It was Xavier calling from the luxury cruise ship. I let the phone vibrate for several long seconds, taking a deep breath to smooth away the sharp edges of my confidence. I needed to play the role of the submissive, defeated wife one last time. I arranged my features into a mask of weary resignation, forcing my shoulders to slump slightly, as if the weight of his emotional abuse was finally breaking my spirit. I answered the video call and waited for his face to appear. The screen flickered, and the bright, blinding light of the Caribbean sun flooded my display. Xavier was lounging on a plush white daybed on the private deck of the ship's presidential suite. The sparkling blue ocean stretched out endlessly behind him, creating a picturesque backdrop of tropical perfection. He was wearing designer linen resort wear, a crystal flute of expensive champagne resting effortlessly in his hand. His dark hair was perfectly styled, despite the ocean breeze. He looked the absolute picture of a man who believed he had conquered the world, completely oblivious to the fact that his financial grave had already been dug and paved over. In the background of the video frame, the true source of his arrogant pride was on full display. Vanessa was reclining on a matching sun lounger wearing a tiny designer bikini and sipping a brightly colored tropical cocktail. Her skin was glowing under the island sun, and she was laughing loudly at something out of frame, tossing her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder. Brielle walked into the shot for a moment, holding a large shopping bag from one of the ship's luxury boutiques, showing off a new expensive necklace to her mother. It was a perfectly curated picture of the elite society family Xavier so desperately wanted to project to the world. He looked into the camera with a smug, self-satisfied grin, taking a slow sip of his champagne before he finally spoke to me. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not ask how my day was, or if I was feeling lonely in the large, empty house. He did not even offer a fake apology for abandoning our 5-year anniversary trip. Instead, he leaned closer to the camera, his voice dripping with condescending approval. He told me that he had just spoken with his mother on the satellite phone. He said Geraldine had informed him about the little incident with the event planner and the frozen credit card. His eyes locked onto mine through the digital connection, and his smile widened into a cruel sneer. "I saw you paid the $40,000 invoice for the Sweet 16 out of your own retirement savings," he said. "Good girl, Vivian. It is about time you stepped up and made yourself useful to the people who matter. It is definitely time you learned how to be a real team player and actually contribute to this family, since you obviously cannot contribute in other ways." The casual cruelty of his words was meant to cut me down to the bone. He was deliberately throwing my painful struggle with infertility right back in my face, using it as a weapon to justify extorting my life savings. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to feel utterly worthless and replaceable. He took another sip of his champagne and let out a relaxed sigh, telling me not to worry too much about the money, because he was handling much bigger things. He said he was going to be very busy the next morning, because he was officially signing the final escrow papers for Vanessa's new $2 million Bahamian villa. He wanted to make sure I knew exactly how much he was spending on his ex-wife, while I was supposedly draining my meager retirement fund just to keep his daughter's party planners happy. Do not be jealous, Vivian. He told me, his tone shifting into a patronizing lecture. Vanessa gave me a beautiful child. She gave me an heir to carry on the family legacy, and she deserves to be rewarded properly for that. She is a woman of high society, and she requires a certain standard of living to maintain our image. You, on the other hand, should just be incredibly grateful that a man of my stature and wealth even lets you live in my beautiful house. Most men would have thrown you out onto the street years ago when they realized you were defective. But I am a generous man. Just keep the house clean and try not to ruin my good mood while I am out here enjoying the fruits of my labor. I will be home in a week, and I expect a hot meal waiting for me. He took another sip of his drink, waiting for my inevitable tears. He expected me to cry. He expected me to beg for his affection or apologize for being such a massive disappointment to his bloodline. He wanted the supreme satisfaction of watching me break while his beautiful society ex-wife lounged luxuriously in the background. His entire narcissistic ego demanded my complete submission. I did not cry. I did not scream or raise my voice or try to defend my dignity. I just stared at him through the screen, letting a long, heavy silence stretch across the digital connection. The ocean breeze blew through his microphone, creating a soft, static noise that filled the quiet space of my office. My face remained perfectly blank, completely devoid of the fragile emotion he was so desperately trying to provoke. I watched as his smug smile started to falter, just a fraction under my deadpan gaze. The silence was making him uncomfortable. He shifted his weight on the daybed, his brow furrowing slightly as he tried to understand why I was not reacting to his psychological abuse. He expected hysteria, and instead I was giving him a hollow, icy void. I tilted my head slightly, resting my hands on my desk. I looked directly into his eyes, stripping away the fake persona of the quiet, timid tax clerk. I let him see the cold, calculating CEO staring back at him. I spoke in a voice as calm and flat as glacial ice. I asked him, "Are you absolutely sure it is your house, Xavier?" Before he could even process the words or formulate a response, I tapped the red button and ended the video call. The screen went completely black, cutting off the bright Caribbean sun and the sound of the ocean. I placed my phone face down on my desk and let out a slow, steady breath. The final performance was officially over. There was no more acting required. I turned my chair around to face the woman sitting quietly on the leather sofa across from my desk. My elite property attorney had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. She was a ruthless legal shark who specialized in high-asset corporate real estate acquisitions, and she had been working with me in absolute secrecy for the past 8 months. I stood up and walked over to my secure filing cabinet, retrieving a thick stack of verified property deeds and mortgage transfer documents. I walked back to the sofa and slid the heavy stack of papers across the glass coffee table toward her. Months ago, Xavier had decided he needed more liquid capital to help cover up the massive holes he was digging in his corporate ledgers. He thought he was executing a brilliant covert financial maneuver by secretly refinancing our luxury Washington townhouse through an obscure private lending firm. He wanted to extract the massive equity from the property without raising any red flags with his own internal auditors or his traditional banking contacts. He thought he was an untouchable genius, moving money around like pieces on a chessboard, exploiting loopholes that only men of his elite caliber could possibly understand. He had absolutely no idea that the obscure private lending firm he had approached was actually a shell company entirely owned and operated by my own forensic accounting network. He had willingly signed over the primary mortgage of the estate directly to my covert limited liability company. I had bought the debt on the very house we lived in, using the legitimate massive profits from my federal contracting work. Xavier walked around the townhouse every single day, acting like the king of the castle, demanding that I keep his floors clean and his shirts pressed. He constantly threw the value of the home in my face, using it to remind me that I was just a charity case living under his wealthy roof. He used the house to make me feel small and dependent. He did not own the house. He did not own the roof. He was technically just my residential tenant, and he was severely behind on his moral and financial rent. I looked down at the attorney and gave her a firm nod of approval. She smiled a sharp professional smile and opened her briefcase, sliding the final foreclosure and eviction notices into a pristine red folder. Xavier had failed to read the intricate fine print of the private lending contract, blinded by his own arrogance and his desperate need for fast, untraceable cash. The contract included strict, immediate foreclosure clauses triggered by any federal indictment or freezing of assets. Because I had already initiated the federal freeze on his offshore accounts, the default clause was automatically activated. Xavier was sitting on a yacht in international waters, dreaming about buying a $2 million villa with money that no longer existed. He was completely oblivious to the terrifying reality that was about to crash down on his head. His offshore accounts were seized. His co-conspirators were deeply implicated in federal wire fraud. His career was over, and he no longer even owned the bed he slept in. The illusion of his elite black excellence was entirely shattered. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was already drafting the arrest warrants, and his formal eviction notice was going to be delivered right alongside his federal indictment. I turned back to my massive monitors, watching the continuous flow of data as my team dismantled the last remaining fragments of his criminal life. The ordinary tax clerk he had so casually discarded was now the sole owner of his entire reality, and the destruction of his empire was finally absolute. The brilliant green text on my monitor pulsed with a quiet, rhythmic certainty, confirming that Spencer had just unknowingly handed me the keys to his entire illicit kingdom. I sat in the stillness of my secure home office, the glow of the dual screens reflecting in my eyes as I methodically began to map out the newly acquired data. Spencer's administrative credentials gave me an unobstructed view into the darkest corners of Xavier's wealth management firm. I spent the next few hours meticulously tracing the digital blood trail they had left behind. The ledgers revealed a staggering level of greed. They had not just skimmed from wealthy investors, they had systematically drained the pension funds of retired teachers, the trust accounts of widows, and the college savings of young families. Every stolen dollar was neatly categorized, washed through Spencer's fake vendor invoices, and funneled into the offshore holding companies. I downloaded the entire database directly onto the federal encrypted servers, ensuring that no one could ever erase or alter the evidence. The trap was now fully armed and completely inescapable. Xavier was isolated on his luxury cruise ship, and Spencer was blissfully unaware that his arrogance had just sealed his own fate. All that remained was to systematically dismantle the local enablers who had spent years thriving on the stolen spoils of my husband's corruption. The opportunity arrived the very next afternoon. I was sitting at my kitchen island enjoying a cup of dark roast coffee when my secondary tracking monitor chimed with a high-priority alert. The financial snare I had set using the $40,000 invoice for Brielle's Sweet 16 party was officially triggering. The alert pinpointed a specific geographical location in the most exclusive high-end shopping district of downtown Washington. Geraldine and Tanya were currently inside a luxury bridal and party boutique, doing exactly what they did best, which was aggressively spending money that did not belong to them. They were there to finalize the extravagant custom wardrobe, the imported silk draperies, and the final aesthetic touches for Vanessa's teenage daughter. My system showed Tanya's platinum card attempting to authorize a massive secondary charge for custom crystal centerpieces and premium catering upgrades. The transaction was immediately declined. She tried a second card linked to a different Shell account. Declined. She tried a third card. Declined. Every single financial avenue tied to the Wilson family name had been entirely frozen by the Department of Justice the moment I approved that initial party invoice. Right on cue, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently against the granite countertop. The caller ID displayed Geraldine's private number. I let it ring 3 times before picking it up and answering with a perfectly neutral tone. Vivian Geraldine's voice came through the speaker as a frantic, high-pitched shriek that completely lacked her usual aristocratic polish and pretension. "You need to call the bank right this second. Every single card we have is declining, and the boutique manager here is looking at us like we are common thieves. Fix this now before we are humiliated in front of the entire staff." I could hear Tanya in the background complaining loudly about how incompetent I was, and how Xavier was going to be absolutely furious when he found out his wife could not even handle a simple banking error. I kept my voice completely calm and told Geraldine to stay exactly where she was. I told her I would drive down and handle the situation personally. She huffed and told me to hurry up before hanging up the phone without a single word of thanks. I grabbed my keys and walked out to my car. The drive to the luxury boutique took 20 minutes. The afternoon sun was bright, and the city streets were filled with the very people Geraldine and Tanya so desperately wanted to impress. For the entire duration of my marriage, I had silently endured their endless snide remarks about my modest vehicle, my lack of designer handbags, and my quiet, unassuming lifestyle. Tanya had stood in my kitchen just days ago, mocking my hybrid sedan and my plain clothes, completely unaware that I purposely chose to live stealthily wealthy. They thought my silence was weakness. They mistook my professional restraint for submission. They believed that because I did not flaunt my wealth, I must be poor and uneducated. They had no idea that my personal net worth eclipsed their entire family fortune, or that my supposed boring bookkeeping job was actually a cover for running an elite forensic accounting firm. They were about to learn a very hard lesson about the dangers of underestimating the quiet woman in the room. As I pulled up to the curb outside the elegant glass front boutique, I saw 2 unmarked black sport utility vehicles silently pull up behind me. 4 federal agents stepped out wearing dark suits and serious expressions. The raid had been perfectly synchronized with my arrival. The lead agent gave me a brief professional nod as we approached the entrance. I walked through the heavy glass doors of the boutique with the federal agents entering right behind me in a coordinated tactical formation. The interior of the store was a sea of white tulle, expensive lace, and glittering crystal chandeliers. Right in the center of the plush showroom stood Geraldine and Tanya. They were surrounded by terrified shop assistants and an incredibly uncomfortable store manager who was holding a declined credit card as if it were a live grenade. When Geraldine saw me walk in, her face twisted into a mask of furious entitlement. She marched toward me with her expensive designer bag clutched tightly in her hand, her heels sinking deeply into the pristine white carpet. "Vivian," she snapped, her voice echoing harshly off the mirrored walls. "What took you so long? I told you to call the bank, not drive down here like an idiot. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? We have been standing here for 20 minutes looking like absolute fools." Tanya crossed her arms and tapped her foot impatiently, stepping up beside her mother-in-law to join the attack. "Seriously," Vivian, Tanya chimed in, rolling her eyes dramatically. "You are completely useless. Xavier is going to be so angry when he gets back from his cruise. Just give them your little debit card and use whatever meager savings you have left so we can finally leave this place." I stood perfectly still, letting their toxic insults wash over me for the very last time. I looked at their angry, entitled faces and felt absolutely nothing but cold, analytical precision. Before I could even respond, the lead federal agent stepped smoothly around me and flashed his gold badge directly in Geraldine's face. He identified himself loudly and clearly, announcing that they were executing a federal seizure of all assets tied to Xavier Wilson and his known associates. The agent instructed everyone in the store to remain calm and directed his team to secure the premises. Geraldine's mouth fell open, her furious expression instantly melting into a look of absolute sheer panic. The heavy designer bag slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a dull thud. Tanya physically stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror as she looked from the federal agents to me. "What are you talking about?" Geraldine demanded, her voice trembling uncontrollably. "This is a mistake. You cannot do this. My son is a senior vice president at a major wealth management firm. We are prominent members of society. You have no right to treat us like criminals." I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and the women who had tormented me for years. I looked at them with eyes as cold as ice, completely stripping away the submissive persona I had worn to protect my investigation. I told them there was no mistake. I told them that Xavier was currently the primary target of a massive federal money laundering investigation, and that his entire corporate empire was built entirely on stolen client funds. Geraldine shook her head violently, refusing to accept the reality crumbling around her. She pointed a shaking finger at me and demanded that I fix the situation, claiming that I was an accountant and that I should know how to clear up this ridiculous misunderstanding. She ordered me to tell the agents that Xavier was an honest man. "I did not just pay that $40,000 invoice, Geraldine," I said, my voice echoing clearly and calmly through the quiet boutique. I flagged it. The room went dead silent as my words registered in her panicked mind. I approved that transaction using a specialized federal tracking protocol. I continued, my gaze never leaving her face. "That massive payment for Brielle's Suite 16 linked you, Vanessa, and the party planners directly to the offshore shell companies Xavier has been using to hide stolen capital." Tanya let out a choked gasp, covering her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked down at the expensive designer clothes she was wearing, suddenly realizing that every single thread was bought with dirty money. I watched the exact moment the devastating truth finally pierced through their armor of absolute denial. "The money Xavier has been funneling to you and Tanya for years," I explained methodically, "to pay for your luxury cars, your country club memberships, and your designer clothes was stolen from the pensions of innocent working-class people. You are no longer just his family. You are now officially documented accessories to federal wire fraud." The illusion of their high society life had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotting criminal foundation underneath. They had spent years mocking my simple clothes, my dependable car, and my quiet job, entirely blind to the fact that their entire existence was funded by theft and deceit. The federal agents moved in closer, separating the two women and instructing them to hand over their phones and any remaining credit cards. Tanya began to weep hysterically, begging the agents to believe that she knew nothing about the money and blaming Xavier and Spencer for everything. The fierce, unyielding loyalty they had always claimed to possess dissolved instantly the moment they faced actual consequences. Geraldine looked at me with wild, desperate eyes. The arrogant matriarch who had once demanded that I serve her the best cuts of meat, and who had constantly belittled my career, was now completely broken. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the sleeve of my simple beige blouse. Her knuckles were white with terror. "Vivian, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "You cannot let them do this to us. We are family. You have to help us. Xavier is your husband. You owe us family loyalty. We took you in when you had nothing. You cannot just stand there and watch them destroy our lives." I looked down at her shaking hand, clutching my sleeve, and then looked directly into her terrified eyes. I remembered every single insult, every microaggression, and every time she had intentionally made me feel small and worthless in her grand dining room. I remembered how easily she had tried to extort my life savings just a few days ago, claiming I owed her because I could not give her son a child. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my arm, brushing the fabric smooth with slow, deliberate movements. "You told me I was not family, remember?" I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any sympathy. "You made it very clear that I was just a temporary placeholder who did not understand black excellence or corporate wealth. You said I was just a maid who belonged in the background. Well, Geraldine, it turns out I understand corporate wealth perfectly. Enjoy the public defender." I turned my back on them and walked out of the luxury boutique, the heavy glass doors closing softly behind me. I did not look back as the federal agents escorted the weeping women out of the store to face the total destruction of their carefully curated lives. The crisp afternoon air felt incredibly clean as I walked toward my modest, dependable car. The trap had officially snapped shut on the local enablers, and my quiet little life belonged entirely to me once again. There was still more work to be done to ensure Xavier and Spencer faced the full weight of the justice system, but the heaviest chains of my false marriage had finally been broken. I unlocked my car and drove away from the shopping district, leaving the shattered remnants of the Wilson family legacy far behind me. Ordinary tax clerks were not supposed to take down multi-million-dollar criminal syndicates, but then again, I was never ordinary to begin with. I smiled to myself as I merged onto the highway, the digital blood trail now permanently paved over with undeniable federal evidence. The game was over and I had won. The quiet hum of my computer fan was the only sound in my office as I prepared for the final execution. Geraldine and Tanya were currently sitting in federal holding cells, but the head of the snake was still basking in the tropical sun. It was exactly 2:55 in the afternoon. In 5 minutes, the emergency board of directors meeting for Xavier's wealth management firm was scheduled to begin. I had been secretly communicating with the chairman of the board for the past 3 weeks, feeding him undeniable proof of the rot inside his company. He had arranged this remote meeting under the guise of discussing quarterly projections and executive restructuring. Xavier had bragged to me just days ago that he was expecting a massive promotion to senior partner. He thought this call was going to be his coronation. I clicked the secure link and entered the virtual boardroom, keeping my camera and microphone deactivated. The screen was divided into neat little squares, showing the various board members sitting in their dark wood-paneled offices. At exactly 3 o'clock, a new square popped onto the screen. It was Xavier. He was broadcasting from a breathtaking luxury suite in the Bahamas. The ocean glittered brightly through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. He was wearing a crisp, unbuttoned white linen shirt and holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. His hair was perfectly styled, and his face carried the relaxed, arrogant glow of a man who believed he was completely untouchable. He greeted the board members with his trademark charismatic smile, completely unaware that he was walking into a digital slaughterhouse. The chairman of the board did not return his smile. The older man sat rigidly at the head of a massive conference table in New York, looking directly into the camera with an expression of absolute disgust. The pleasantries were entirely skipped. The chairman announced that this emergency meeting was not about quarterly projections or promotions. He stated in a voice like gravel that the internal auditing software had flagged severe anomalies in the primary escrow accounts. He revealed that over $12 million in client funds had mysteriously vanished over the past 3 years. Xavier's confident smile faltered just a fraction, but he quickly recovered, attempting to mask his sudden panic with professional concern. He leaned forward and assured the board that he and Spencer would launch an immediate internal review to locate the missing funds. He tried to sound like the responsible, dedicated executive ready to solve the problem. The chairman stopped him mid-sentence. He told Xavier that an internal review would not be necessary because the board had already quietly hired an external forensic accounting firm to track the missing $12 million. The chairman announced that the external forensic CEO was currently on the call to present the final devastating findings. My finger hovered over the mouse. I clicked the button to activate my camera and microphone. My face instantly appeared on the main presentation screen, replacing the corporate logo. I was wearing a sharp, tailored black blazer, my hair pulled back tightly, my expression completely devoid of any emotion. Xavier's eyes widened in absolute sheer horror as he stared at his screen. His mouth fell open, and the crystal glass in his hand trembled. He leaned closer to his laptop, squinting as if his eyes were deceiving him. He stammered out my name, asking what I was doing on a highly classified corporate call. He demanded to know why his simple-minded tax clerk wife was hacking into a board meeting. I did not address him as my husband. I did not acknowledge our marriage or our history. I spoke to him with the cold, clinical precision of a predator examining its prey. I introduced myself to the board using my full professional title. I shared my secondary monitor broadcasting a complex digital map of Xavier's entire criminal enterprise directly to every single executive on the call. The screen filled with glowing red lines connecting the dots of his massive fraud. I methodically narrated the exact flow of the embezzled money. I showed them how Spencer had created phantom vendor accounts to siphon cash from the corporate escrow. I tracked every single stolen dollar as it moved from the firm to the fake vendors and then directly into Xavier's offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands. I displayed the wire transfer receipts, the falsified tax documents, and the direct routing numbers that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that Xavier was the mastermind behind the theft. I spoke without taking a single breath, delivering the facts with heavy, brutal blows. I watched Xavier's face cycle through profound shock, absolute denial, and finally sheer animalistic panic. The tropical sun streaming into his luxury suite suddenly seemed to mock his impending doom. He started screaming at his computer monitor, his voice cracking with hysteria. He yelled that the documents were forged and that I was an insane, jealous wife trying to ruin his life because he was leaving me. He hyperventilated, grabbing his chest as his entire reality fractured and collapsed around him. He begged the chairman not to listen to me swearing on his life that he was a loyal senior executive and that I was just a pathetic, bitter woman seeking revenge. The chairman let Xavier's frantic, pathetic screams echo through the virtual boardroom for several long seconds before raising his hand to silence him. The chairman's voice cut through the chaos like a heavy iron blade. He told Xavier that the evidence was incontrovertible and that his behavior was a disgrace to the firm. He looked directly into the camera and delivered the final fatal blow. "You are terminated immediately," Xavier, the chairman, stated. The board members watched in stunned silence as the golden boy of the firm was completely destroyed. The chairman then turned his attention back to my square on the screen. His tone shifted to one of profound professional respect. "Vivian," he said clearly, "you have our full authorization to proceed with law enforcement and hand over all findings to the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Xavier's eyes darted wildly around his luxury Bahamian suite, as if looking for a way to escape the digital prison I had just locked him inside. He looked back at the screen, staring at the quiet, ordinary woman he had systematically abused and discarded for years. He finally realized that I had never been a victim. I had been the architect of his total annihilation. He let out a guttural sound of pure defeat and violently slammed his laptop shut, severing the connection. His screen went black, but the image of his shattered, terrified face was permanently burned into my memory. The meeting ended, and I sat back in my chair, the silence of my office feeling incredibly sweet. The heavy silence in my office was a stark contrast to the absolute chaos I knew was erupting thousands of miles away. Xavier stared at the black screen of his laptop, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The luxurious ocean breeze blowing through his suite suddenly felt suffocating. His perfectly constructed reality had just been violently shattered, and the fragments were actively cutting him to ribbons. For years he had looked at me and seen a quiet, submissive tax clerk, a woman too broken by her own physical shortcomings to ever pose a threat to a man of his immense stature. He had mocked my simple clothes, my dependable car, and my modest salary while secretly using my very existence as a shield for his criminal empire. It took him exactly 10 seconds sitting in that paralyzing silence to finally understand the catastrophic magnitude of his mistake. I was not a victim. I had never been a victim. I was the undercover federal auditor who had patiently, meticulously woven a digital noose around his neck while smiling at him across the dinner table. Pure animalistic panic finally broke through Xavier's shock. He jumped up from the plush leather chair, knocking it backward onto the polished hardwood floor. He frantically began tearing through the drawers of the suite, searching for his passport, his emergency cash, and any small valuables he could carry. His mind raced through survival scenarios, calculating how much time he had before the Bahamian authorities received the official federal warrants. If he could just get off the ship before it officially docked, he could charter a private seaplane to a non-extradition country. He needed to move fast, and he needed to leave a trail of confusion behind him. He burst through the glass doors onto the private sun deck, where Vanessa was still lounging in her designer bikini, sipping her tropical cocktail. Brielle was sitting on the edge of the private plunge pool, complaining about the ship's internet speed. Xavier did not bother explaining the truth. He barked at them to get up and pack their bags immediately. Vanessa let out a loud, dramatic sigh, lowering her sunglasses and glaring at him. She told him he was being completely ridiculous and that she was not going to ruin her perfect tan just because he was having a sudden mood swing. Xavier grabbed her by the arm, his grip tightening until she gasped in pain. He dragged her off the lounger, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper telling her that there was a massive security threat against his firm and they needed to evacuate the ship for their own safety. Vanessa and Brielle spent the next 20 minutes complaining bitterly as they shoved expensive clothes and jewelry into their heavy designer suitcases. Xavier paced the room, sweating profusely through his expensive linen shirt. He kept checking his phone, praying to see a message from Spencer, confirming that the domestic assets were somehow still secure. His phone remained entirely silent. The moment the luggage was zipped shut, Xavier grabbed the heaviest bags and practically dragged his ex-wife and daughter out of the suite. They hurried down the carpeted corridors of the luxury liner, pushing past bewildered vacationers and ignoring the polite greetings of the ship's staff. Xavier kept his head down, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. He knew that every single second mattered. The ship had already initiated its docking procedures at the port of Nassau. Xavier forced his family down the emergency stairwells, bypassing the crowded elevators, to reach the lower disembarkation decks. Vanessa whined about her expensive heels blistering her feet, while Brielle cried about leaving behind her new friends from the teen lounge. Xavier ignored them completely, his eyes darting around searching for Port Authority officers. When they finally spilled out onto the concrete pier, the oppressive Caribbean heat hit them like a physical wall. Xavier was drenched in sweat, his carefully styled hair plastered to his forehead. They dragged their heavy luggage across the terminal, joining the massive line of tourists waiting to process through the local customs and immigration checkpoint. The line moved with agonizing slowness. Xavier kept looking over his shoulder, his paranoia spiking with every loud noise or sudden movement in the crowd. They were just 50 feet away from the exit doors. 50 feet away from hailing a cab to the private airfield. 50 feet away from escaping the crushing weight of federal justice. Vanessa stood beside him, fanning herself with a glossy travel brochure and complaining loudly about the lack of air conditioning in the terminal. Brielle was leaning against her suitcase, texting furiously on her phone, completely oblivious to the fact that her luxurious high society life was breathing its final few gasps. They were just 10 feet away from the customs desk when Xavier's phone suddenly vibrated in his pocket. He dropped the handle of his suitcase and snatched the device, hoping desperately that it was Spencer telling him the offshore accounts were safe. He looked at the screen and felt the remaining blood drain completely from his face. It was a text message from me. I had timed the message perfectly, watching his exact GPS location on my tracking monitor as he moved through the port terminal. I wanted him to read the words in the exact moment his freedom officially evaporated. The text message read, "You were right. Brielle needs both her parents. Good thing you will both be in federal prison." The $850,000 went straight to the IRS. I am the auditor who built your indictment. Checkmate. Xavier stared at the glowing screen, his mind completely short-circuiting. The cruel gaslighting words he had spoken to me just an hour ago on the video call were now echoing back to him as his ultimate death sentence. He realized in that exact moment that there was no escape. I had not just frozen his accounts. I had seized the massive wire transfer he tried to send out and routed it directly to the Internal Revenue Service. I had built the entire federal case against him from inside his own home. His legs gave out, and the expensive smartphone slipped from his trembling fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a sharp crack that shattered the glass screen. He looked up, his eyes wide and vacant. The local customs agent sitting behind the plexiglass desk slowly stood up and stepped backward, raising his hands in a clear signal. Suddenly, the doors surrounding the checkpoint flew open. 6 heavily armed agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working in joint coordination with the Royal Bahamian Police Force, swarmed into the terminal. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, cutting through the crowd of shocked tourists and converging directly on the Wilson family. Xavier did not even try to run. He simply fell to his knees on the dirty concrete, raising his hands above his head as a federal agent aggressively shoved him face down and yanked his arms behind his back. The loud, unmistakable click of heavy metal handcuffs echoing through the terminal signaled the permanent end of Xavier Wilson. Vanessa let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream as 2 female officers grabbed her arms. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels and screaming that she was a wealthy society woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The lead FBI agent looked her dead in the eye and loudly informed her that she was being placed under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit money laundering and tax evasion. The luxury villa, the designer clothes, the exclusive country club memberships, they were all funded by money stolen from innocent people, and her signature was on every single fraudulent offshore holding company. The officers forced her arms behind her back and clamped the handcuffs tightly around her wrists, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical protests. Brielle stood frozen in horror, watching her parents being physically restrained by armed officers. The arrogant, entitled teenager who had spent her entire life looking down on people suddenly realized that she was entirely alone. She began to sob uncontrollably, calling out for her mother. A social worker from the local Child Protective Services stepped forward, gently pulling the crying teenager away from the luggage. Since both of her biological parents were currently being taken into federal custody, she was officially a ward of the state until a suitable guardian could be located. The public destruction of their high society facade was absolute. Hundreds of cruise passengers stood watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, powerful Wilson family was reduced to a crying, struggling mess of federal suspects. Vacationers pulled out their phones, recording the humiliating spectacle as Xavier and Vanessa were hauled roughly to their feet and marched out of the terminal toward the waiting police cruisers. Vanessa's expensive designer dress was wrinkled and stained with sweat, her carefully constructed image entirely shattered. Xavier walked with his head hung low, utterly defeated by the woman he had spent years trying to destroy. The flashing blue and red lights of the police vehicles illuminated their terrified faces as they were shoved into the back seats, driving away to face the devastating reality of a federal holding cell. Thousands of miles away, in a luxury high-rise condominium in downtown Washington, D.C., Spencer was currently experiencing his own personal nightmare. He was standing in the middle of his pristine, minimalist living room, staring in absolute horror at the massive flat-screen television mounted on his wall. He had been pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon to celebrate what he thought was Xavier's promotion. But the breaking news banner flashing across the bottom of the screen made the glass slip from his fingers and shatter on the hardwood floor. The news anchor was reporting live, covering a massive coordinated federal raid on a prominent local wealth management firm. Footage of FBI agents carrying boxes of hard drives and financial records out of Spencer's own corporate headquarters played on a continuous loop. The banner text in bright, glaring letters read, "Senior executive arrested in Bahamas amid massive fraud investigation." Spencer's heart hammered furiously against his ribs as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He backed away from the television, his breathing growing ragged and shallow. He remembered the arrogant, condescending conversation he had with me in my dining room just 24 hours ago. He remembered logging into his secure corporate laptop on my home network, laughing at my supposed ignorance while I served him a glass of water. The terrifying realization hit him like a freight train. The quiet, submissive wife he had treated like absolute garbage was actually a federal apex predator, and she had just used him to burn their entire criminal empire to the ground. He knew without a single doubt that his name was next on the list. He sprinted into his master bedroom, his hands shaking violently as he pulled a large black canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of his closet. He scrambled to the hidden wall safe behind his full-length mirror, spinning the dial with frantic, panicked movements. He pulled out thick, heavy stacks of emergency $100 bills, tossing them carelessly into the duffel bag. He grabbed his secondary encrypted phone, his untraceable burner laptop, and a highly realistic forged Canadian passport he had purchased years ago for exactly this type of catastrophic emergency. Spencer zipped the bag shut, his eyes darting wildly around the room, as if expecting federal agents to burst through his windows at any second. He ran out of the condominium, bypassing the elevators entirely, and sprinting down 4 flights of concrete stairs to the private parking garage. He threw the heavy duffel bag into the passenger seat of his black sports car and slammed his foot on the accelerator. The tires squealed loudly against the painted concrete as he sped out of the garage, merging recklessly into the heavy evening traffic. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He kept checking his rearview mirror, terrified of seeing the flashing lights of federal pursuit. He took the highway exit, heading frantically toward Dulles International Airport, praying he could buy a cash ticket on the first flight out of the country before Vivian's invisible web completely closed around him. The fluorescent lights of Dulles International Airport blurred past Spencer as he practically ran through the massive glass doors. His heart was hammering against his ribs, but a wave of relief washed over him the moment he stepped into the chaotic international terminal. He adjusted the heavy canvas duffel bag on his shoulder, feeling the comforting weight of the cash and his forged documents. The drive from downtown Washington had been a terrifying blur of swerving through traffic and constantly checking his rearview mirror for flashing lights. He had been convinced that at any moment the federal agents who had raided his corporate headquarters would descend upon his vehicle. But he had made it. He bypassed the regular ticketing lines, heading straight for the premium international desk. Presenting the fake Canadian passport was the only hurdle left. The agent barely glanced at him before scanning the document and handing him a first-class boarding pass for a direct flight to Zurich. Spencer forced a charming smile, thanking the agent before heading toward the exclusive security checkpoint. He was breathing easier now. The panic that had gripped him in his luxury condominium was slowly dissolving into his usual arrogant confidence. Ordinary people got caught in federal sweeps, but men like Spencer were built to slip through the cracks. He possessed the kind of generational wealth and corporate insulation that made him virtually untouchable. Once through security, he made his way to the elite first-class lounge. The heavy glass doors glided open, revealing a quiet sanctuary of plush leather chairs, dim ambient lighting, and an open premium bar. It was a world away from the panicked crowds in the main terminal. Spencer found a secluded corner seat facing the large windows overlooking the tarmac. He dropped his duffel bag between his feet and let out a long, shaky breath. He had actually done it. Xavier was probably rotting in a Caribbean jail cell right now, taking the fall for the entire operation. Xavier had always been the flashy one, the arrogant face of the firm, while Spencer played the quiet, brilliant architect behind the scenes. They would pin the offshore accounts on Xavier, and Spencer would simply disappear into the European banking sector with a new identity and millions in untraceable assets. He signaled a passing attendant and ordered a premium Scotch neat. He watched the large commercial airplanes taxiing across the runway, feeling a profound sense of superiority. The game was over and he had survived because he was simply smarter than everyone else. A soft clink of glass on the table in front of him broke his deep concentration. Spencer looked up, expecting to see the lounge attendant returning with his drink. Instead, the blood froze entirely in his veins. I was sitting in the plush leather chair directly across from him. I was holding a delicate martini glass, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the clear liquid. I looked completely out of place in my tailored beige suit against the dark leather of the lounge, but my posture was relaxed, radiating an absolute, terrifying calm. Spencer blinked hard for a second, believing his mind was playing tricks on him, born of stress and paranoia. But I did not vanish. I just lowered my glass and looked at him with cold, calculating eyes. "What the hell are you doing here?" Spencer demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper. He looked around the quiet lounge, half expecting federal agents to jump out from behind the mahogany bar. When no one moved, his arrogant corporate persona snapped right back into place. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and let out a short, cruel laugh. "You really think you are something special, do you not? Vivian," he sneered. "You think because you caught Xavier slipping, you can just waltz in here and take me down too? You are completely out of your depth. I am not some idiot who leaves a paper trail. My name is not on a single document. My signature is nowhere near those offshore holding companies. You cannot pin this on me. I am entirely insulated from the fallout. You are just an angry black woman making a scene because you realize you are going to end up with nothing after the divorce." I sat perfectly still, letting his racist and misogynistic insult hang in the quiet air between us. He truly believed his white corporate privilege was an impenetrable shield. He thought his background, his elite education, and his gender made him intellectually superior to me. He thought I was just a bitter spouse acting out of blind emotion. I placed my martini glass gently on the coaster and reached into my leather tote bag. I pulled out a slim digital tablet and slid it smoothly across the polished wood table until it stopped right in front of his hands. I told him to take a look at his insulation. Spencer scoffed, but his eyes darted down to the glowing screen. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in an expensive tailored suit. "You see, Spencer?" I began, my voice low and meticulously. "Even you made a very critical error when you came to my house for dinner last month. You were so eager to mock me in my own dining room, so eager to prove how much smarter you were than Xavier's quiet little wife. You logged into your secure corporate virtual private network, using my home internet connection. You bypassed your own firm's $1 million firewall just to send a few emails and check your balances, while I poured you a glass of water. My home network is a federal-grade encrypted monitoring station. The moment your laptop connected, my system intercepted and logged every single keystroke. I have your direct internal protocol address authorizing the final series of wire transfers to the Cayman Islands. I have the exact digital fingerprint of you shifting the stolen pension funds into the shell accounts. Xavier was just the greedy idiot pressing the buttons, but you wrote the code. You are not insulated, Spencer. You are the primary target of a massive federal indictment." Spencer's hands began to shake so violently that he could not even push the tablet away. He looked at the screen, seeing his own encrypted login credentials and the exact timestamps of his illegal transfers laid out in undeniable black and white. The arrogant smirk had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the hollow, terrified stare of a man who realized his life was entirely over. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked from the tablet to me, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as his brilliant criminal mind completely short-circuited. The reality of his impending destruction crushed the last remaining fragments of his ego. He reached down for the handle of his canvas duffel bag, a desperate instinctual urge to run taking over his failing body. Before his fingers could even graze the heavy canvas, two massive figures stepped silently out of the shadows behind his chair. They were United States Marshals wearing dark tactical gear and grim expressions. They moved with terrifying efficiency. One marshal clamped a heavy hand down on Spencer's shoulder, pinning him to the leather chair, while the other reached down and kicked the duffel bag full of cash out of his reach. Spencer let out a pathetic, choked gasp as his arms were forcibly wrenched behind his back. The harsh metallic sound of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet first-class lounge, causing a few wealthy travelers to turn their heads in shock. The marshals hauled him roughly to his feet. His fake Canadian passport and his millions in stolen cash were now completely useless. I remained seated looking up at his terrified, sweating face. The absolute destruction of his elite privilege was finally complete. I picked up my martini glass and took one final celebratory sip before leaning in close so only he could hear my parting words. Math is hard. Is it not? Spencer? I whispered. He let out a broken sobbing sound as the marshals dragged him away in cuffs, leaving me alone to enjoy the absolute silence of total victory. The heavy mahogany doors of the federal courthouse swung shut with a resounding thud that echoed through the cold marble corridors, sealing the ultimate fate of the men who had once believed they owned the world. The trial had been a relentless media spectacle, a total dismantling of a multi-million-dollar criminal syndicate that had spent years preying on the vulnerable and the elderly. I sat in the back row of the gallery, wearing a simple tailored gray suit, watching the final judgment unfold with quiet, absolute satisfaction. The air in the room was thick with tension as the jury delivered their final verdict, confirming every single charge I had meticulously mapped out on the digital blood trail. Xavier stood before the federal judge completely stripped of his custom, Italian suits, his expensive watches, and his arrogant, charismatic smile. He was wearing a standard-issue bright orange jumpsuit, his wrists shackled to a heavy chain around his waist. His perfectly groomed hair was unkempt, his shoulders slumped in absolute miserable defeat. The judge read the sentencing guidelines with cold authority, detailing the millions of dollars stolen from working-class families and the absolute lack of remorse shown by the defendants. Xavier was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He flinched violently as the sentence was handed down, his eyes darting desperately toward the gallery, looking for any sympathetic face but finding absolutely nothing but the hard stares of the people he had ruined. Spencer received an even harsher reality check from the justice system. Because he had attempted to flee the country with a forged Canadian passport and millions in stolen cash, the judge showed absolutely no mercy. The brilliant corporate architect who thought his white privilege and technical genius made him untouchable was sentenced to 18 long years. Spencer wept openly in the crowded courtroom, his face buried in his shackled hands, completely broken by the reality that his elite education and societal insulation meant absolutely nothing against the crushing weight of undeniable federal evidence. The men who had built an empire on lies were now nothing more than federal inmates' numbers in a system they could no longer manipulate or control. The collateral damage extended far beyond the men in the orange jumpsuits. The women who had thrived on their stolen wealth were facing their own agonizing and highly public destruction. Vanessa, the woman who had flaunted her stolen luxury in my face and demanded I step aside, was entirely bankrupt. Her massive suburban estate had been seized by the federal government, along with every designer handbag, luxury vehicle, and offshore shell account she possessed. She was publicly stripped of her prestigious Jack and Jill Society membership, her name completely erased from the elite social circles she had once ruthlessly dominated. To pay back her court-ordered restitution, Vanessa was forced to take a minimum wage job as a cashier at a local discount retail store. I drove past it once just to see it for myself. Watching the former high society queen wearing a cheap polyester uniform, scanning clearance items under harsh fluorescent lights while dealing with angry customers was the ultimate poetic justice. The arrogance that had defined her entire existence had been ground into the cheap linoleum floor. Geraldine and Tanya did not fare any better in the aftermath of the federal sweep. The sprawling generational mansion that Geraldine had paraded as a symbol of her aristocratic superiority was subjected to immediate and ruthless asset forfeiture. Federal agents had marched up the pristine driveway and placed bright foreclosure notices right over the heavy brass knocker on her front door. Large moving trucks had hauled away the expensive silk draperies, the imported crystal chandeliers, and the massive dining room table, where she had spent years insulting my career and demanding I serve her like a maid. The matriarch who had constantly belittled my modest lifestyle was now living in a cramped two-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city with Tanya. Their credit was completely destroyed, their bank accounts entirely frozen. The high society facade they had worshipped above all else had been violently and publicly ripped away, leaving them with nothing but the bitter taste of their own absolute humiliation. 3 months after the sentencing, my personal cell phone buzzed as I was sitting in my quiet home office. The caller ID indicated an incoming collect call from a federal correctional facility in upstate Pennsylvania. I accepted the charges, letting the line connect and waiting in the silence. Xavier's voice came through the receiver, sounding incredibly small and desperate, completely hollowed out by the harsh, brutal reality of his new life behind bars. "Vivian," he pleaded, his voice cracking with a pathetic attempt at his old charm. "Please talk to me." He spent the next 5 minutes begging for my forgiveness, trying to pull on emotional threads that had been permanently severed years ago. He claimed that he had lost his way, that the money and the power had blinded him, but that deep down he had always loved me and respected my intellect. When I did not respond to his tears, he tried to pivot back to his favorite tactic, which was pure manipulative gaslighting. He told me that his daughter Brielle needed a mother figure now that Vanessa was disgraced, and that I was the only one who could guide her. "Come on, Viv," he whispered desperately, pressing the phone tight against his face. "We were a team, you and me. We built a life together, and we can still figure this out when I get out of here. You know I always saw the real you." I let his pathetic, desperate words hang in the air for a long moment. Listening to the background noise of the federal prison humming through the phone line, I leaned back in my chair, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, analytical closure. I did not raise my voice or show even a fraction of emotional distress. I spoke with the same steady precision I had used to dismantle his entire life. I was a team, Xavier. I stated flatly, the absolute truth ringing clear through the receiver. You were just a liability. I did not wait to hear his response or his inevitable angry outburst. I pressed the red button on my screen, terminating the call instantly. I opened my phone settings and permanently blocked the facility's routing number, erasing Xavier Wilson from my existence forever. The final heavy chain of my false marriage had been completely and totally severed. 6 months later, I stood on the expansive glass balcony of my newly purchased ultra-luxurious penthouse in the heart of Washington, D.C. The night air was crisp and clear, and the illuminated monuments glowed brightly against the dark sky. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the prestigious building, featuring panoramic views, imported marble floors, and a state-of-the-art biometric security system. But the true beauty of the evening was not the real estate itself. It was the remarkable event taking place inside my home. I was hosting a private gala, an exclusive networking gathering designed specifically to celebrate and uplift young, aspiring African-American female accountants, engineers, and financial analysts. The massive living area was filled with the soft, elegant sounds of a live jazz quartet and the vibrant, energetic conversations of brilliant Black women who were ready to take the corporate world by absolute storm. I had entirely funded the evening using my own immense personal wealth, launching a comprehensive charitable scholarship program designed to pay the full university tuitions for every single young woman in the room. I walked through the elegant crowd wearing a stunning floor-length emerald green gown that moved like liquid silk. There was no need to hide in plain clothes or dull my shine any longer. The undercover operation was over, and I was exactly who I was meant to be. Young women approached me throughout the night, thanking me for the financial support and asking for professional mentorship. I listened to their big dreams, their fierce ambitions, and their struggles within male-dominated industries, recognizing the same sharp intelligence and unwavering determination that had fueled my own long journey. I spoke with a young engineering student who wanted to build sustainable infrastructure for underprivileged communities, and a brilliant finance major who wanted to reform corporate tax laws. I told them to never shrink themselves to fit into rooms that were too small to hold their genius. I looked around the penthouse, seeing the manifestation of true black girl magic, a powerful community built on genuine support, brilliant minds, and unbreakable strength. I did not need validation from a toxic matriarch who worshipped a false, fading aristocracy. I did not need the approval of a cheating, manipulative husband who thought he could use my quiet nature as collateral for his crimes. I certainly did not need acceptance from an arrogant, corrupt society that constantly underestimated quiet, observant women. The people who had tried to bury me were now buried beneath the weight of their own monumental greed, and I had risen above all of it completely unscathed. A waiter walked past carrying a polished silver tray. I reached out and took a crystal flute of vintage champagne, the golden bubbles rising perfectly to the surface. I stepped back toward the open glass doors of the balcony, looking out over the glittering lights of the capital city. The digital blood trails, the offshore accounts, the federal raids, and the spectacular, humiliating downfall of the Wilson family felt like a distant, fated lifetime ago. Ordinary tax clerks were supposed to fade into the background, serving as stepping stones for powerful men. But I had rewritten the entire corporate narrative. I raised my champagne glass to the night sky, offering a silent toast to the incredible, limitless future I had secured for myself and the women I was pulling up behind me. The ultimate trap had been sprung. The garbage had been taken out and the slate was beautifully, flawlessly clean. I was the sole, undisputed architect of my own empire, and the foundation was completely bulletproof. Fade to black. True worth is never defined by those who belittle you. Toxic families and deceitful partners thrive on your submission, but silence should never be mistaken for weakness. By quietly investing in yourself, protecting your boundaries, and building your own foundation, you transform from a scapegoat into an unstoppable force. Justice doesn't come from waiting for abusers to change. It comes from strategically reclaiming your power and walking away. Your greatest revenge is realizing you never needed their validation to finally succeed. If you've ever had to cut toxic ties to build your own empire, share your triumph in the comments and subscribe for more empowering stories.